The stars above Earth burned with enemy fire as Jake Morrison crawled through the broken corridors of Luna Base. His uniform was torn and covered in dust from the explosions that had torn through the human defense station 6 hours ago. Behind him, 11 other Navy SEALs moved in silence, their weapons ready, their eyes scanning for threats in every shadow. The Krethian Empire had come to the Sol system with thousands of warships, and humanity had lasted exactly 42 days before every major military installation fell silent. Jake pressed himself against a cracked wall and looked through a shattered window at Earth below. Orange and red flames traced lines across the blue planet as Krethian dreadnoughts burned their way through the atmosphere. He had watched those ships destroy the orbital defense platforms, the space stations, and every human vessel that tried to stop them. The enemy was methodical and efficient, like they had done this 1,000 times before. They probably had. Humans were new to space warfare, still learning how to fight beyond their own atmosphere, and the Krethians had been conquering worlds for thousands of years. Lieutenant Amy Carter moved up beside Jake and handed him a damaged communication device. She had been trying to reach Earth Command for 3 days without success. Her blonde hair was tied back and her face showed the exhaustion they all felt. She shook her head when Jake looked at her, confirming what he already knew. Command was gone. The generals, the admirals, the politicians who had promised Earth could defend itself against any threat, they were all either dead or captured. The Krethians had won the conventional war in 6 weeks. Chief Greg Palmer gathered the team in what used to be the base cafeteria. The big man from Texas had 20 years of experience in special operations, and his calm presence kept the younger SEALs focused. He spread out a salvaged map on a table and began marking the locations where they knew Krethian forces were stationed. Luna Base was still partially occupied by enemy soldiers, but they seemed more interested in securing the communication equipment than hunting for survivors. That gave Jake's team an advantage. The Krethians thought the war was over. Petty Officer Danny Cruz was working on something in the corner, his hands moving quickly as he assembled explosive charges from materials they had scavenged. The young demolitions expert from California had a gift for making things explode, and he had already identified 3 critical points in the base where a few well-placed charges could cause maximum damage. He looked up and grinned at Jake despite everything they had lost. Danny still believed they could fight back. Jake appreciated that optimism, even if it seemed crazy. The Krethian broadcast came through on every frequency at exactly noon Earth time. Supreme General Vrakthar appeared on every screen that still worked, his alien face displaying what humans interpreted as satisfaction. He spoke in perfect English, which meant the Krethians had been studying humanity for longer than anyone had realized. His message was simple and devastating. All human military forces had been defeated. All space vessels had been destroyed. All command structures had been eliminated. The war was over. Humanity could surrender now and be integrated into the Krethian Empire as workers and servants, or they could resist and be exterminated. He gave them 48 hours to decide. Jake watched the broadcast with his team gathered around him. He saw the hope drain from some of their faces, saw the reality of their situation sink in. They were 12 people hiding in a broken base on a dead moon, while an empire of millions celebrated victory over humanity. By every measure that mattered in conventional warfare, the Krethians were right. They had won. Earth's armies were scattered and broken. The navies were scrap metal floating in orbit. The air forces had been shot down in the first week. There was no organized resistance left, no chain of command, no possibility of reinforcement. But Jake Morrison had been a Navy SEAL for 15 years, and he knew something the Krethians did not understand. He stood up and looked at each member of his team in turn. He saw Amy Carter straightening her shoulders. He saw Greg Palmer nodding slowly. He saw Danny Cruz setting down his tools and waiting. The younger SEALs watched Jake with questions in their eyes, waiting for him to tell them what to do next. Jake began to speak in a quiet voice that somehow carried authority, despite the desperate situation. He reminded them of their training, of the months and years they had spent learning to operate behind enemy lines. He reminded them that SEALs did not fight like regular soldiers. They did not need armies or fleets or air support to accomplish their missions. They worked in small teams, struck from the shadows, and disappeared before the enemy knew what happened. He reminded them of rule number 1, the fundamental principle that every SEAL learned and never forgot. Rule number 1 was simple. Never stop fighting, not when you were tired, not when you were outnumbered, not when victory seemed impossible. You fought until you won or until you died. And sometimes you kept fighting even after the enemy thought you were dead. The Creathians had defeated Earth's conventional forces, but they had never faced an enemy like Navy SEALs. They had never dealt with warriors who specialized in impossible missions, who thrived in chaos, who turned disadvantages into advantages. Amy Carter was the first to speak after Jake finished. She said they needed intelligence on Creathian operations, their supply lines, their command structures, their weaknesses. Greg Palmer added that they needed to contact any other surviving special operations teams that might still be operating in the Sol system. Danny Crew suggested they start by making the Creathians understand that occupying Luna Base would cost them dearly. The other SEALs began contributing ideas, their training overriding their fear and exhaustion. Jake listened to his team planning their first operation and felt something like pride. The Creathians thought they had won because they controlled the orbital space and the major installations. They thought defeating the conventional military meant defeating humanity. They were about to learn a hard lesson. Humans had been fighting guerrilla wars, asymmetric conflicts, and special operations missions for thousands of years. They had refined the art of making powerful enemies regret their victories. The Creathians had won the easy part of the war. Now the hard part would begin. Over the next 3 hours, the team prepared for their first strike. They would hit the Creathian communication center in the northern section of Luna Base, destroy their long-range transmitters, and eliminate as many enemy soldiers as possible before fading back into the tunnels. It was a small operation, almost insignificant in the scope of an interstellar war, but it would send a message. It would tell the Creathian Empire that humanity was not defeated, just adapting. It would be the first step in a new kind of war, one fought by warriors who understood that losing every battle did not mean losing the war. Jake Morrison checked his weapon one final time and looked at his team. They were ready. The Creathians believed they had won. They had forgotten to account for rule number 1. That mistake would cost them everything. 2 months had passed since the Creathian Empire declared victory over humanity. Their occupation forces had settled into comfortable routines across the Sol system, believing the defeated humans posed no real threat. The galaxy watched with mild interest as another primitive species learned their place in the cosmic order. What the Creathians did not know was that they had only defeated the conventional military forces. They had never encountered the unconventional warriors who now operated in the shadows. Jake Morrison stood in a hidden command center deep within the asteroid belt and studied the holographic display showing Creathian positions throughout the solar system. What had started as 12 Navy SEALs on Luna Base had grown into something larger and more dangerous. Over 300 special operations personnel had survived the invasion and refused to surrender. Former Green Berets, Delta Force operators, Marine Raiders, and Air Force combat controllers had all found ways to continue the fight. They called themselves the Ghost Protocol because officially, according to Creathian records, they were all dead. Captain Lisa Bennett worked at a station nearby, her fingers moving rapidly across alien technology that she had learned to operate through trial and error. Before the war, she had been a Navy intelligence officer specializing in electronic warfare. Now she was the Ghost Protocol's information specialist, and she had accomplished something the Creathians thought impossible. She had tapped into their communication networks without being detected. Every order, every status report, every casual conversation between Creathian soldiers flowed through her systems. The enemy was talking, and Lisa was listening to every word. The first major strike had happened 3 weeks ago on Earth itself. Sergeant Kevin Wright had led a team of 8 operators into the occupied city of New York, moving through the ruins of buildings and abandoned subway tunnels. The Creathians had established a regional command center in what used to be a human government building, and they protected it with over 200 soldiers. Kevin's team had studied the base for 6 days, learning guard rotations, identifying weak points, and planning their approach with meticulous care. They entered the compound hidden inside a supply transport that Lisa had diverted through careful manipulation of Creathian logistics systems. The alien soldiers barely glanced at the vehicle as it passed through 3 security checkpoints. Kevin and his team lay silent among crates of equipment, breathing slowly, waiting for the right moment. When the transport stopped inside the loading bay, They emerged with weapons ready and moved through the building like ghosts. They placed explosive charges at critical structural points and in the main communication center. The entire operation took 47 minutes from entry to extraction. The explosion destroyed 3 floors of the command center and killed 73 Krathian officers. By the time reinforcements arrived, Kevin and his team had vanished into the underground transit system. The Krathians searched for weeks but found nothing. No bodies, no evidence, no explanation for how humans had penetrated their security. General Vrakthar ordered increased patrols and stricter protocols, but he still believed these were isolated incidents. He could not imagine organized resistance from a defeated species. On Mars, Lieutenant Commander Brenda Cole was planning something even more ambitious. Before the invasion, she had commanded a nuclear submarine, and she understood how to operate large vessels with small crews. The Krathians had parked several destroyers in orbit around Mars, using them as mobile command posts for occupation forces on the surface. Brenda had studied their designs through stolen technical manuals that Lisa provided, and she had found a critical weakness. The ships relied on biometric security, but the system could be fooled by someone who understood the underlying technology. Brenda's team spent 2 months preparing for the mission. They captured lone Krathian soldiers and studied their biology. They built devices that could replicate alien biomarkers. They trained on simulators that Lisa constructed from captured data. When they finally made their move, everything had to work perfectly. There would be no second chance. They approached the target destroyer in a small salvaged shuttle that appeared on Krathian scanners as a routine supply run. The destroyer's automated systems accepted their fake credentials and allowed them to dock. Once aboard, Brenda's team of 12 operators moved with ruthless efficiency. They had memorized the ship's layout and knew exactly where to go. The Krathian crew of 97 soldiers never expected an attack from inside their own vessel. The humans used silenced weapons and hand-to-hand combat to eliminate targets without raising alarms. Within 30 minutes, they controlled the bridge. Within an hour, they had secured engineering. The Krathians finally realized something was wrong when the ship's weapon systems activated without authorization. Brenda turned the destroyers' guns on 2 nearby Krathian vessels and opened fire before they could raise shields. The surprise attack destroyed both ships completely. Then she aimed at the Krathian ground installations and fired every missile the destroyer carried. By the time the enemy fleet reacted and began converging on her position, Brenda had already evacuated her team in escape pods. The pods scattered in different directions, their small signatures lost among the debris field. The Krathians destroyed the captured destroyer, but all 12 human operators survived and made it back to their hidden bases. General Vrakthar called an emergency meeting with his senior officers after the Mars incident. The situation had changed from annoying to alarming. His forces had lost 3 major command centers, 4 warships, and over 600 soldiers in the past month. Supply convoys were being ambushed. Patrol units were disappearing. Key installations were experiencing mysterious system failures. The humans were fighting back, and they were doing it in ways that violated every rule of civilized warfare. They attacked from ambush, refused open battle, and showed no honor in their tactics. Admiral Kirex, the oldest and most experienced Krathian officer, tried to explain what they were facing. He had taken the time to study human military history, something most Krathians considered beneath them. What he discovered disturbed him greatly. Humans had been fighting asymmetric wars against superior enemies for their entire history. They had developed and refined special operations tactics over thousands of years of conflict. They knew how to win wars they should lose. They knew how to turn weakness into strength. The Admiral showed his fellow officers historical records of human conflicts. He showed them how small groups of trained warriors had defeated larger armies through unconventional tactics. He showed them how humans adapted to any enemy and found ways to exploit weaknesses. He showed them that humans did not fight by the established rules because they had never agreed to those rules in the first place. The Krathians were fighting an enemy that played a completely different game. Jake Morrison would have appreciated the Admiral's analysis, though it would not have changed anything. He was currently reviewing plans for the next operation with Amy Carter and Greg Palmer. Lisa had identified a critical target on Titan, one of Saturn's moons. The Krathians had built massive fuel refineries there to supply their occupation fleet. The refineries processed raw materials into the exotic fuel that powered Krathian ships. Without those refineries, the entire fleet would be grounded within weeks. The mission would be dangerous and complex. Titan's atmosphere was toxic, and the refineries were heavily guarded. Getting close enough to plant explosives would require days of careful infiltration through hostile territory. The team would be completely isolated with no possibility of extraction if things went wrong. But the potential impact made the risk acceptable. Destroying the refineries would cripple the Krethian fleet and force them to divert resources to protecting their remaining fuel production. Facilities. Danny Cruz volunteered immediately when Jake explained the mission. The young SEAL had proven himself repeatedly over the past 2 months, and his expertise with explosives made him essential for this operation. Chief Warrant Officer Nicole Hayes also joined the team, bringing her experience with underwater operations that would translate well to Titan's methane lakes. Gunnery Sergeant Chris Donovan rounded out the strike team with his skills in long-range reconnaissance. As the 4 operators prepared their equipment and studied the intelligence Lisa provided, Jake felt a grim satisfaction. The Krethians had won every conventional battle, but they were losing the unconventional war. Every attack forced them to spread their forces thinner. Every destroyed installation made them more defensive. Every lost ship damaged their confidence. The humans were winning by refusing to lose, by fighting on their own terms, by never stopping no matter how impossible victory seemed. The Ghost Protocol was teaching the galaxy a lesson that humans had learned long ago. Winning battles did not guarantee winning wars. Sometimes the side that lost everything except their will to fight became the most dangerous enemy of all. The methane lakes of Titan rippled under the dim light of distant Saturn as Jake Morrison and his team moved through the toxic atmosphere. Their modified environment suits kept them alive in conditions that would kill an unprotected human in seconds, and the specialized equipment they carried was designed to be invisible to Krethian sensors. The 4 operators had been moving toward the fuel refineries for 3 days, crossing frozen plains and swimming through liquid methane seas. The journey was exhausting and dangerous, but it was the only way to approach the target without being detected. Nicole Hayes led the way through the murky depths of another methane lake, her movement smooth and confident despite the alien environment. Before the invasion, she had been a combat diver specializing in underwater demolitions. The skills that served her in Earth's oceans translated surprisingly well to Titan's hydrocarbon seas. She surfaced carefully near the shore and signaled that the path ahead was clear. The refineries loomed in the distance, their towers reaching into the orange sky, processing the raw materials that kept the Krethian occupation fleet operational. Chris Donovan established their observation post on a ridge overlooking the facility. The big Marine had spent years conducting reconnaissance in hostile territory, and his patience was legendary among special operations personnel. He set up monitoring equipment and began cataloging everything he saw. Guard rotations, vehicle movements, shift changes, security protocols. Every piece of information was valuable. Every pattern could be exploited. He recorded everything while Jake and the others reviewed their approach routes and identified the best locations for placing charges. Danny Cruz studied the refinery structure through powerful optics and smiled despite the danger they faced. The facility was impressive by any standard, a massive complex of processing towers, storage tanks, and distribution systems. But to Danny's trained eye, it was also incredibly vulnerable. The Krethians had built for efficiency rather than security, probably because they never imagined anyone would attack a facility this deep in their controlled territory. The main processing centers were connected to the storage tanks through exposed pipelines that carried millions of gallons of volatile fuel. A few well-placed explosives could trigger a chain reaction that would destroy the entire facility. The team spent 18 hours observing before Jake approved the final plan. They would split into 2 groups and enter the facility during the next shift change when security was most distracted. Nicole and Chris would plant charges on the main storage tanks while Jake and Danny targeted the processing centers. They had calculated the timing precisely. All charges would detonate simultaneously, and the team would have approximately 4 minutes to reach their extraction point before the entire complex went up in flames. 4 minutes was not much time, but SEALs had trained for years to operate under that kind of pressure. The shift change happened exactly when Lisa Bennett predicted from her monitoring station in the asteroid belt. The Krethian workers were creatures of habit, and their rigid adherence to schedules made them predictable. Jake watched through his scope as the day shift left and the night shift arrived. During those 15 minutes of transition, security was focused on processing personnel rather than watching for external threats. That was the window the team needed. They moved like shadows across the facility's perimeter, staying low and using every bit of cover available. Jake's heart rate stayed steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. He had done this hundreds of times during training and dozens of times in real combat. Fear was useful if you controlled it, deadly if you let it control you. Beside him, Danny moved with equal confidence. The young SEAL had matured rapidly over the past few months, and Jake trusted him completely. Nicole and Chris split off toward the storage tank section while Jake and Danny continued toward the main processing towers. The facility was massive, covering several square miles of Titan surface. Krethian workers moved between buildings unaware that death was walking among them. Jake did not enjoy killing, but he understood necessity. Every Krethian working here was supporting the occupation of Earth. Every gallon of fuel they processed kept enemy warships operational. This was not murder. This was war. They reached the first processing tower and Danny went to work immediately. His hands moved with practiced efficiency as he placed shaped charges on critical support structures and fuel lines. The explosives were human-made, crafted from materials the Ghost Protocol had salvaged and modified. Each charge was carefully calculated to cause maximum damage. Danny worked quickly but never carelessly. A single mistake could alert security or cause a premature detonation. After 10 minutes, the first tower was rigged and they moved to the second. Nicole and Chris encountered a problem at the storage tanks. A Krethian supervisor was conducting an unscheduled inspection, walking the perimeter with 2 armed guards. Chris signaled to Nicole and they froze in position, hidden behind a row of pipes, barely breathing. The supervisor stopped near their position and began examining a control panel. He was less than 20 feet away. One guard stood beside him, while the other walked a patrol route that would bring him within touching distance of Nicole's hiding spot in approximately 30 seconds. Nicole made her decision instantly. She could not let the guard discover them, and she could not risk alerting the entire facility with weapons fire. She waited until the guard was at the precise right position, then moved. Her knife entered between his armor plates and found his heart before he could make a sound. She lowered the body silently while Chris dealt with the second guard using the same method. The supervisor turned at the sound of movement and died before he could trigger an alarm. 3 Krethians dead in less than 10 seconds, and the facility's security network showed no indication that anything was wrong. They resumed planting charges on the massive storage tanks, working against the clock. Each tank held enough fuel to power a Krethian destroyer for months. There were 37 tanks in this section alone, and Nicole placed charges on 12 of them. The resulting explosion would ignite the others through sympathetic detonation. The entire storage facility would become a fireball visible from orbit. She finished her work and contacted Jake through their secure communication channel. All charges placed. Ready for extraction, Jake confirmed that his team had also completed their objectives. All 4 operators began moving toward their designated extraction point on the far side of the facility. They had timed their route to minimize exposure to security patrols. Lisa had calculated the most efficient path based on her analysis of Krethian movement patterns. The team reached the extraction point with 90 seconds to spare before the planned detonation time. Danny armed all the charges through a remote signal. The devices began their countdown sequence, 4 minutes until detonation. The team moved quickly away from the facility, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the coming explosion. They had practiced this extraction dozens of times in simulation. Every operator knew exactly where to go and what to do. They reached the shelter of a rocky outcrop 3 miles from the refinery with 30 seconds remaining. The explosion was larger than even Danny had predicted. The initial charges detonated simultaneously, destroying the processing towers and rupturing the storage tanks. The fuel ignited in a massive fireball that rose hundreds of feet into Titan's atmosphere. Secondary explosions followed as the fire spread through the pipeline network. Within minutes, the entire facility was engulfed in flames. The heat was intense enough that Jake felt it through his environment suit despite being miles away. Lisa confirmed through intercepted Krethian communications that the destruction was total. 80% of the refining capacity in the Sol system had just been eliminated. The occupation fleet would begin rationing fuel immediately. More importantly, The Krethians were already pulling warships from other duties to establish protective perimeters around their remaining refineries. Every ship guarding a refinery was one less ship hunting human resistance fighters. Every soldier protecting a supply depot was one less soldier. Enforcing the occupation, the 4 operators began their long journey back to the extraction shuttle they had hidden on the far side of Titan. The mission had been a complete success. They had struck a devastating blow against the enemy without losing a single team member. But Jake knew this was just one operation in a much longer war. The Krethians would adapt and improve their security. They would become more cautious and more ruthless. The Ghost Protocol would need to stay ahead of them, anticipate their responses, and continue finding new ways to hurt them. General Vrakthar received the news about Titan while meeting with his senior staff. The report was devastating. His fuel reserves were now critically low. His fleet would need to reduce operations by 60% to conserve what remained. He would need to request additional resources from the Krethian homeworld, which would make him look incompetent. The humans had done this. The supposedly defeated species that should be serving as workers in his empire had destroyed one of the most critical facilities in the Sol system. 6 months had passed since the Krethian Empire invaded the Sol system, and General Vrakthar stood before the High Council through a holographic transmission, feeling something he had never experienced in his long military career. He felt doubt. The occupation that should have been simple routine had become a nightmare of logistics and security. His forces had grown from the original invasion fleet of 3,000 ships to over 9,000 vessels, and still they were losing ground. The humans had no remaining military infrastructure, no organized command structure, no industrial capacity, yet somehow they were winning. The High Council members listened to his report with expressions that Vrakthar interpreted as displeasure. He explained how human resistance fighters operated in small teams, striking critical targets and disappearing before reinforcements could arrive. He described the loss of the Titan refineries and the resulting fuel crisis. He detailed the ambushes on supply convoys, the destruction of communication centers, and the mysterious disappearances of patrol units. Every week brought new attacks, and his soldiers were becoming afraid to leave their fortified positions. Councillor Thrain asked the obvious question: how could a defeated species cause such damage? Vrakthar had no good answer. The humans fought without honor, refusing to meet Krethian forces in open battle. They used tactics that violated every principle of civilized warfare. They were terrorists rather than soldiers, and terrorism was something the Krethian military had no training or experience in combating. The Empire had conquered 47 different species over the past 1,000 years, but none of them had resisted like this. Admiral Kyrex spoke up from his position at the back of the transmission chamber. He reminded the Council that he had warned them about humanity's nature. Humans had evolved on a world where they were not the dominant predators, where they had to use intelligence and persistence to survive against stronger and faster creatures. They had developed warfare into an art form over thousands of years of nearly constant conflict. They knew how to fight enemies with superior technology and numbers. They excelled at turning disadvantages into advantages. The Council debated their options for hours. Councillor Drexus proposed what he called the final solution. They could exterminate humanity from orbit, burning Earth and all its colonies until nothing remained. Several council members supported this approach. If humans could not be controlled, they should be eliminated. The resources of the Sol system were valuable, but not worth the cost in Krethian lives and military resources that the occupation was demanding. Other councillors disagreed. Genocide would damage the Empire's reputation among other species, and possibly encourage more resistance in future conquests. Councillor Thrain suggested negotiation instead. They could offer humanity limited autonomy in exchange for peace. Let the humans govern themselves under Krethian oversight. Treat them as reluctant allies rather than conquered subjects. It would be unprecedented, but the current situation was also unprecedented. While the Krethian leadership debated humanity's fate, Jake Morrison was examining something extraordinary in a hidden facility deep in the Kuiper Belt. His team had discovered 3 experimental stealth ships that had been in construction when the invasion began. The shipyard workers had died defending their facility, but they had hidden the ships before the Krethians could find them. The vessels were incomplete, lacking weapon systems and full power plants, but they had one critical advantage. They were invisible to Krethian sensors. Commander Rachel Torres was supervising the effort to finish the ships. Before the war, she had been part of Naval Special Warfare Development Group, the unit that most people knew as SEAL Team 6. She understood cutting-edge technology and had the skills to lead the technical team working on the vessels. For 4 months, over 60 people had worked around the clock to complete what the original builders had started. They cannibalized parts from destroyed human ships, modified Krethian technology they had captured, and improvised solutions to problems that would have stopped conventional engineers. The 3 ships were finally operational. Rachel had named them Silent Blade, Shadow Walker, and Night Runner. Each vessel could carry 20 personnel and had enough supplies for a month-long mission. They had minimal weapons, just enough for self-defense, but that was not their purpose. These ships were built for infiltration and reconnaissance. They could go places that no other human vessel could reach. They could travel to the heart of enemy territory and return without being detected. Jake stood on the bridge of Silent Blade and felt a mixture of excitement and dread. Lisa Bennett had proposed a mission so audacious that most of the Ghost Protocol leadership thought it was suicide. They would take all 3 stealth ships and travel to the Krethian home system. They would strike at the heart of the Empire itself, not a military target but a political one. They would infiltrate the capital world of Krathos Prime and attack the High Council while it was in session. The goal was not to win a battle but to send a message. No one in the galaxy would be safe from humanity's reach. Amy Carter would captain Shadow Walker while Greg Palmer commanded Night Runner. The 3 ships would carry a total of 43 operators, the best fighters the Ghost Protocol had. They would be volunteers only because the mission had almost no chance of success. Even if they reached Krathos Prime undetected, even if they successfully infiltrated the most heavily defended planet in the Empire, the chances of escaping afterward were minimal. This would likely be a one-way mission. Danny Cruz was among the first to volunteer. The young SEAL had proven himself repeatedly over the past months, and he understood what Jake was attempting. Kevin Wright volunteered along with his entire team. Brenda Cole left her operations on Mars to join the mission. Nicole Hayes and Chris Donovan signed up without hesitation. One by one, the best operators in the Ghost Protocol stepped forward and accepted the suicide mission. Lisa provided them with everything she had learned about the Krethian home system. She had been intercepting their communications for months and had built detailed maps of their capital world. She knew when the High Council met, where they met, and how security was arranged. She knew the orbital defense network and the patrol schedules. She had identified a window of opportunity that would give them 12 minutes to reach the surface before backup systems detected them. 12 minutes was not much, but it was enough. The 3 stealth ships departed from the Kuiper Belt facility with no ceremony or celebration. They simply left, slipping into the dark spaces between stars where light took years to travel. The journey would take weeks through hyperspace routes that Lisa had calculated from captured Krethian navigation data. They would be completely alone with no support and no communication with Earth. If they failed, if they died, no one would know what happened to them. Jake used the time during the journey to prepare his team mentally and physically. They drilled constantly, practicing their assault plan until everyone could execute their role perfectly. They studied Krethian anatomy to learn the most efficient ways to kill. They reviewed the Capitol building's layout until they could navigate it blindfolded. They trained for every possible contingency and several impossible ones. On the 10th day of the journey, Jake gathered everyone in Silent Blade's cargo bay for a briefing. He wanted to make sure they all understood what they were attempting. The Krethian High Council was meeting to decide humanity's fate. Intelligence suggested they were seriously considering complete extermination. If that decision was made, the Ghost Protocol could not stop it. Earth's remaining population would be burned from orbit before resistance fighters could do anything to prevent it. This mission was humanity's last chance to change the equation. He explained that their goal was not to kill the entire council, though that would be a bonus. Their goal was to prove that humanity could strike anywhere at any time. They needed to shatter the Krethian sense of security. They needed to make the Empire understand that occupying Earth would cost more than it was worth. They needed to demonstrate that humans would never stop fighting, not for years or decades or generations. They would fight until they won or until they were extinct. Amy spoke up and asked the question everyone was thinking. What if they succeeded but could not escape? What if they completed the mission and died on Krethos Prime? Jake did not sugarcoat his answer. Then they would die having accomplished something that would echo through history. They would die knowing they had given Earth a fighting chance. They would die as warriors who had never quit, never surrendered, and never forgotten rule number 1. The ships emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the Krethian home system 3 weeks after leaving Earth. They immediately went silent, drifting like debris through the outer system while their sensors mapped everything. The defenses were even more impressive than Lisa had described. Thousands of orbital platforms, hundreds of patrol ships and sensor networks that covered every possible approach vector. Krethos Prime was considered absolutely impregnable, the safest place in the entire empire. The attack came during the height of Krethian morning, when the capital city was fully awake and the High Council was deep in debate about humanity's extermination. Greg Palmer positioned Night Runner exactly where Rachel Torres had calculated, his hand steady on the controls despite knowing what would happen next. He armed the ship's missiles and targeted the main power relay station that fed energy to every orbital defense platform surrounding Krethos Prime. The station was heavily shielded and protected, but the missiles Greg carried were designed to penetrate Krethian defenses. He whispered a prayer his grandmother had taught him years ago and fired. The missiles streaked across space and slammed into the relay station with devastating precision. The explosion was massive, tearing the station apart and sending cascading failures through the entire defense network. Every orbital platform went dark simultaneously. Every sensor array stopped functioning. Every automated weapon system shut down. The most heavily defended planet in the Krethian Empire was suddenly blind and helpless. Greg knew he had maybe 30 seconds before every ship in the system turned their guns on him. He used those seconds to transmit a final message to Jake and Amy, telling them to make it count. Then he pushed Night Runner's engines to maximum and tried to escape. Jake watched from Silent Blade as the defense grid collapsed exactly as planned. He did not waste time thinking about Greg's survival chances. The mission came first. He pushed his ship into a steep dive toward the planet's surface with Shadow Walker following close behind. The two vessels screamed through the atmosphere at speeds that made their hulls glow red. Amy's voice came through the communication channel, calm and professional despite the insane risk they were taking. She confirmed her team was ready and her approach vector was good. The capital city of Krethos Prime spread below them like a jewel, towers of crystal and metal reaching toward the sky. The Imperial Command Center stood at the heart of the city, a massive structure that housed the government and military leadership. That was their target. Jake brought Silent Blade down in a controlled crash landing on a platform near the command center, while Amy set Shadow Walker down 3 blocks away. Both teams emerged from their ships within seconds, weapons ready, moving with the speed and precision that came from months of training and combat. The Krethians in the area froze in confusion. They had never experienced an attack on their homeworld. The concept was so foreign that many of them simply stood and stared at the human soldiers running past them. That confusion lasted approximately 40 seconds before alarms began screaming across the entire city. Security forces started mobilizing, but they were responding to something they had no procedures or training for. Enemy soldiers were on the ground in the heart of their capital, and no one knew how to handle it. Jake's team of 22 operators hit the command center like a hammer. Danny Cruz blew the main entrance with shaped charges that he had carried all the way from Earth. Kevin Wright led the first squad through the breach, his weapon firing in controlled bursts that dropped Krethian guards before they could react. The humans moved through the building's corridors with ruthless efficiency, clearing rooms and eliminating threats. They had studied this building's layout for weeks and knew exactly where they needed to go. Amy's team provided external security, establishing a defensive perimeter and holding off the Krethian reinforcements that were beginning to arrive. Brenda Cole had positioned herself with a captured Krethian heavy weapon on a rooftop, overlooking the main approach. She fired into the advancing enemy soldiers with devastating accuracy, buying precious time for Jake's assault team. Nicole Hayes and Chris Donovan worked together to set demolition charges on nearby buildings, creating obstacles and channeling the Krethian response into kill zones where Amy's operators could engage them most effectively. Inside the command center, Jake reached the corridor leading to the High Council chamber. Krethian elite guards attempted to stop him, and died in the attempt. These aliens had trained for decades to protect their leaders, but they had never faced an enemy like Navy SEALs. Jake moved through them with brutal efficiency, his weapon an extension of his will. Behind him, his team maintained formation and cleared threats. They were down to 9 minutes before the orbital defenses came back online. 9 minutes to reach the council, deliver their message, and somehow escape. General Vrakthar was in the council chamber when he heard the explosions. He immediately reached for his sidearm and moved toward the doors, shouting orders to his guards. The High Council members were confused and frightened, completely unprepared for violence in their own sanctuary. Admiral Kyrex grabbed the general's arm and told him to wait, to let the guards handle the threat, but Vrakthar shook him off. He was a warrior, and he would face this enemy personally. The chamber doors exploded inward, and Jake Morrison stepped through the smoke. His armor was scorched and damaged. Blood covered his uniform, though most of it was not his. He carried a rifle in one hand and a folded flag in the other. Behind him, 8 more human soldiers entered the room, their weapons trained on every Krethian present. General Vrakthar raised his weapon, and Jake shot him 3 times in the chest. The general fell, and sudden silence filled the chamber. Jake walked forward into that silence and looked at each council member in turn. He had learned their language during the long journey through hyperspace, studying recordings that Lisa had provided. When he spoke, his words were transmitted across every Krethian communication channel in the system. Lisa had hacked their networks weeks ago and was broadcasting everything from her hidden station in Earth's asteroid belt. Every Krethian in the home system would hear what Jake was about to say. "You believed you won," Jake said in flawless Krethian. His voice was calm despite the adrenaline and exhaustion. "You destroyed our ships, occupied our worlds, killed our soldiers. You thought the war was over because you won every battle. You thought we would surrender because we had no chance of victory." He unfolded the Earth flag and spread it across the council table. The blue field with white stars and red stripes stood out starkly against the alien architecture. This was the flag that had flown over his country, the symbol of the nation that had produced him and trained him and sent him to fight impossible wars. "But you forgot rule number 1, Jake continued. "We never stop fighting. Not when we are losing. Not when victory seems impossible. Not when the entire galaxy thinks we are defeated. We fight until we win or until we are dead. And sometimes we keep fighting even after you think we are dead." Counselor Thrain found his voice and asked what Jake wanted. "What was the point of this attack if they all died here?" Jake smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. He explained that his team had already accomplished their mission. They had proven that humanity could strike anywhere at any time. They had shown that no Krethian was safe as long as the occupation of Earth continued. They had demonstrated that humans would never accept defeat, never surrender, never stop coming. "This is not a negotiation," Jake said. "This is a notification. You have 48 hours to withdraw every Krethian ship and soldier from the Sol system. If you do not, my people will burn your empire to the ground, one world at a time. We will do it from the shadows, from the dark spaces between your planets, from the places you cannot see and cannot defend. We will do it for years, for decades, for generations if necessary." Admiral Kyrex spoke carefully from his position near the back of the chamber. He told Jake that they were one team, one ship. They could not destroy an empire. Jake's smile widened. He said that was exactly what the Krethians had thought about Earth. They had been wrong then, and they were wrong now. Humans did not need massive armies to win wars. They needed warriors who refused to quit. The building shook as the orbital defense grid came back online. Alarms screamed throughout the command center. Kyrex told Jake that his team was trapped, that they would all die here. Jake nodded and said he knew. But they had completed their mission. They had delivered their message. Now it was up to the Krethian High Council to decide whether they wanted peace or endless war. Amy's voice crackled through Jake's communication device. She reported that Shadow Walker was still operational and could extract both teams if they moved immediately. The Krethians were bringing heavy weapons to bear, but there was a narrow window. Jake ordered the retreat and his team began falling back toward the exit. They moved in perfect formation, covering each other, leaving nothing behind except bodies and the Earth flag on the council table. The extraction was chaos. Amy had brought Shadow Walker directly to the command center entrance, hovering despite the incoming fire. Jake's team ran through a hail of plasma bolts and threw themselves aboard. Silent Blade was damaged beyond repair, but Shadow Walker's stealth systems were still functional. Amy pushed the ship into a vertical climb that would have torn apart a normal vessel. They punched through the atmosphere with Creathian fighters in pursuit, but the stealth technology made them nearly impossible to target. Greg Palmer's voice suddenly came through the communication channel. He was alive, and he had Night Runner hidden in the debris field of destroyed defense platforms.